Today I wasted 6 hours of my life finding out everything about how damage drop-off happens in Rust, so you don't ever have to worry about it. The first thing I needed was a shooting range. The easiest way to do this was to find a build server and find an isolated area far away from any other players. Unfortunately, this meant I was not going to get any planes. So I found a peninsula starting off into the ocean in a snow biome surrounded by hills. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't pretty, but there was no one else around blowing things up, and I didn't have to worry about running into somebody else's build and attracting any looky-loos wondering why I had a 150-meter long runway. Through previous tests, I knew a square foundation was 3 meters long. This meant if I put 5 of them back to back, I would get 15 meters. So I did that for each of the 5 different building materials available to us. This would give me a 75-meter long shooting range. The only issue was the previously mentioned terrain was anything but forgiving. But I proceeded anyway. I placed a series of foundations as high as I could, and then I built up walls until they were all level. I put 2 of these 75-meter units back to back, giving me 150 meters of measured out shooting range. On the armored end, I placed an additional foundation and built up a chute. This is where I could ask a friend to stand and allow me to shoot at them and let me know what the damage numbers were after every shot. In theory, this would be perfect. Unfortunately, I don't have any friends. Probably related to the fact I asked them to stand still for 6 hours and auto-respawn in place and feed me data. No, yeah, that tracks. Just like in real life, however, if you don't have friends in Rust, you can always have horses. Just ask any girl who looks remarkably like one, because she's got at least 4 of those darn things. So, on top of my additional foundation, I built a little pen, because horses tend to walk around a little bit, which is fine. But when they're being used for target practice, I prefer them to not move around so much. So we gave it a 1x1 pen. I also worried about, as I used more and more of my equestrian friends, that their hitboxes would start to overlap a little bit, protecting the one that is currently awake with all the ones that are napping. So I left the floors all open except for the top one. Since I was on build server, I could just remove it, and that way instead of having a mass horse grave on the top floor, I had a mass horse grave in my basement. Much less threatening, much more disarming, and now I'm off of any NSA watch list, kept in my basement like a true American. Another convenient fact of using horses instead of people is that people get hurt easily, unfortunately. They only have 100 health, where horses have 400. Unless they're black, then they run faster and have 440. Okay, Rust, if that's how you're going to code things. Which, ignoring Rust racism for a moment, we're just going to ignore that because the actual health doesn't matter. It just matters that I have to replace my friends far less often. Not a big deal for small damage guns like the revolver, but once I started getting into higher damage weapons like the sniper rifles, this was going to prove to be super important. So once I had a friend containment cell on the end of my strip, I needed a better way of knowing how far away I was. As long as your shooting range is level, you can have as many low walls in front of you as you want, and you can still hit your target. So at every foundation intersection, I placed a very low wall, and slowly started adding to my horse collection. I started with the revolver at point blank range, and I kept moving back and just recording the data every time I had to reload. The 10-second timer. There's a 10-second timer, which I assume is for people who deal with other human beings, abusing it during combat. For people who collect horses in their basement, it's just mildly annoying. You couldn't access my data for 10 seconds, and more importantly, I didn't know if I hit my target for 10 seconds, since I wasn't getting hit markers either. Quickly I noticed 2 trends. In my experience with Rust, some guns needed a little bit more compensation than others. You need to aim a little bit higher, and you needed to predict where they're going to move a little bit better, where other guns were a little closer to hit scan. As long as the crosshair was roughly in the face area, it was gonna work. The guns that were closer to the roughly in the face area level of aiming performed much better for bullet drop-off, and the guns that were a little bit more, I need to be psychic to use this thing, didn't do nearly as well with damage drop-off. That leads me to think that they're correlated with the bullet velocity. I would love to have tested this and come up with a formula for you, but I couldn't find any reliable sources for the bullet velocity of each weapon. I also noticed that there was a grace period before any damage fall-off occurred. I always figured that damage fall-off started immediately. So it was nice to see that every weapon had a little bit of space where you got the full damage listed on the card. except for the Thompson. The Thompson just lies to you. I also noticed that once you drop down to 80% of the listed amount, you stopped running into damage drop-off. It just stayed consistent no matter how far back I backed up. We're going to call this the damage minimum, and the listed amount is going to be the maximum damage. Previously, I'd gone through the different armor types and determined how much damage you would take to drop the player wearing that armor in a certain number of shots. For example, if you wanted to one-shot somebody with a shot to the chest wearing full metal, you were going to need to do 200 damage. That number is not exactly relevant, but if you wanted to do it with 4, you needed 50 damage. If you had 49.9, you needed 5. That was far more relevant to this test. If my weapon testing crossed any of these thresholds, I wanted to make a note of it. Simply put, if I am 12 meters away from somebody and this gun performs considerably better at 11 meters, I'm going to take that step forward because it could be the difference between winning a fight and losing a fight. Also, I'd want to know if I had to, if I could step back a little bit and not lose any meaningful damage. So I started with the pistol and worked my way back. The revolver started to have a little bit of drop off at about 4 meters, and at 10 meters we dropped below the first threshold that I'd be concerned with. That is 33.4 damage. Once we drop below that, there's a difference between 3 shots and 4 for an unarmored player, and the difference between 6 and 7 for a fully geared player. Having only 8 bullets in the chamber, needing 7 to land, is a little problematic. At 25 meters we reached the minimum damage. The P250, being a glorified revolver, performed like a glorified revolver. At 4 meters, we started to have a little bit of bullet drop-off. We didn't drop down to that 33.4 damage until 22 meters out, however, and we hit the minimum damage at 31 meters. I expected the Python to do better. We ran into damage drop-off at 10 meters out, which was better than the other pistols. At 25 meters, we dropped below 50 damage. I mentioned earlier why that was really important. We hit the minimum damage at 49 meters, which was pretty impressive for a pistol. The M92, I've always said, was a better all-around weapon than the Python, and damage drop-off seemed to confirm that. We didn't run into any until 13 meters out, and at no point during the curve did I cross any of these major thresholds that we've been talking about. Meaning no matter how far away you are, the pistol's going to perform the same. It's going to need the same number of shots to take somebody out. Most of the other weapons, you need to be conscious of how far away you are to determine how many shots you actually have to land. This one you just don't have to think about it, and that's really convenient. Next, let's move into the SMGs. The worst performer for range, surprising no one, was the Custom. At 7 meters, we started to get a little bit of damage fall off, and at 37 meters, we dropped below 25 damage. At 43 meters, we got to our minimum damage. The Thompson did marginally better, didn't have bullet drop off until 10 meters instead of 7. At the same exact 37 meters, however, we dropped below 33.4 damage, and I just think that's a really interesting data point, that the two Tier 2 SMGs drop below a threshold at the same distance. I don't know if this was intended or just sheer dumb luck by the Rust developers. And we hit our minimum damage at 55 meters. Notably, we never hit for the full damage listed. Even at point blank range, we were missing half a point of damage off of every shot. For a weapon that's talked about so much better than the Custom because of its couple points of damage per bullet, this felt a little cheap to me. I'm being a whiny brat on the internet, but I prefer my video games not lie to me. The MP5 performed considerably better, but that's to be expected with a tier 3 weapon. At about 10 meters, we started to notice a little bit of damage drop off, and at 22 meters, we fell below that 33.4 damage, which is really impressive considering we're only dropping down from 35. At 60 meters, we hit our minimum damage. And that's it for the pistol caliber weapons. The 5.56 caliber weapons performed considerably better across the board. The worst of the bunch was the SAR. We started to get a little bit of damage drop off at 25 meters, and we dropped below that 33.4 mark at 77 meters, which at this point I'd started using a scope because of that 10-second timer and the fact that I wasn't getting hit markers when I encountered my horse friends. I started to miss the occasional shot and not know about it, and this could waste a good 30 seconds, and those added up over the course of 6 hours. At 100 meters, we reached our minimum damage. The M39 was a strict but slight upgrade to the SAR, also surprising no one since that's what the gun is in the game as well. At 31 meters, we started to get a little bit of damage drop off, but that also meant we fell below that 50 damage threshold. Even though the damage numbers were different, they were effectively the same between the two rifles. We didn't hit our minimum damage until 150 meters out, and we didn't pass over any notable thresholds either. The LR started to run to a little bit of damage drop off at 25 meters, but it didn't drop below that 33.4 mark until 80 meters out, and at 100 meters it hit its minimum damage. The AK was really underwhelming, honestly. I expected it to do much better, but just like the SAR and the M39, that's based out of 50 really falls flat. At 25 meters, we started to get a little bit of bullet drop-off, which meant there was no effective difference between the damage of the LR and the damage of the AK, and that just didn't seem worth it for the obnoxious recoil that we had to deal with and the god-awful fire rate of this weapon. At 118 meters, we hit our minimum damage. The M249, well, honestly, it just felt silly to test, because even when we hit our minimum damage, we're hitting for 52, which is more than enough to shred anything. We can still one-shot a naked at 200 meters. At 28 meters, we started to get a little bit of damage fall off, but again, this was insignificant. And at 130 meters, we hit our minimum damage, which was still obnoxiously high for a gun that has the same fire rate as the LR. And then my test broke, because we moved into the sniper rifles. The bolt-action rifle started to have a little bit of damage fall off at 37 meters. At 70 meters, we could still one-shot a coffee can helmet. At 115 meters, we could take out a hazmat suit. And at 157 meters, we could take out somebody wearing a wood helmet with a bandana. At 181 meters, we hit our minimum damage with the bolt action. If you remember, my firing range was built on a cliff and was only 150 meters long, which meant I had to have a long game of Snake with foundations going around, trying to keep up a level floor to be able to test just a little bit further. And then we got into the L96, a gun that I love, but today I hate it. Right now, I hate this gun. We didn't have any damage fall off until 43 meters away. At 82 meters, an additional 12 over the bolt action, we could take out a coffee can helmet, a notable upgrade. At 130 meters, we could take out a hazmat suit, which is an additional 15 meters of range. At 181 meters, at the same distance the bolt action reaches its minimum damage, we could still take out a player with a wooden helmet and a bandana. We didn't hit the minimum range until 196 meters, which means I had to extend out my game of Snake on the back of my shooting range for 200 meters long. I will forgive this weapon, but not for a long time. If you like this video and you'd want to see more in-depth guides like this, please let me know what you'd like to see in the future. And if you somehow just enjoyed listening to my voice, but you have absolutely no idea what I was talking about, I have a series of guides teaching new players how to play Rust to hopefully keep them around a little longer. Please feel free to watch those or send them to anybody who you're hoping to get trapped into the never-ending world that is worrying about your base being raided.